welcome to the S.O.A.P video series from Oak Tree Community Church in South Bend, Indiana. We're working our way through the book of Leviticus, and it's been more exciting, than we thought, or most people would expect. We're about halfway through. We're just past the halfway point. We've got a couple of weeks left in this, right?
Yeah. So what I found is it's a very well thought out book, right? So it kind of makes sense how we're going through. Now, 116 chapters on skin sores and what to do about them.
116 verses,
fortunately. Chapters.
Chapters would be for a while.
And purifications and things you do about it.
Yeah.
Seem like a lot, but this Israel as a nation is new. In fact, it's not even really a nation yet. So they're still trying to figure things out, and it would be a big thing in their lives.
So let's remind
keep it safe.
Yeah, so let's remind the historical context, right? God has rescued them out of Egypt.
Right.
They've been in Egypt for like 400 years, and at least 200 to 300 of those have been in slavery. Right? So they haven't been governing themselves for the most part.
Right.
So now they're at Mount Sinai, and like you said, they're being formed into a nation.
Right.
They're getting their law code. This is going to be not just their religious law, but also their civil law code.
Right.
And the brand new worship, the tabernacle and everything, and God is saying this is how it's going to function.
Yeah, I was going to add in, okay, so while they're in Egypt may have been good from a medical standpoint at that time. They're in a desert now, right? Whatever they would have had access to before, they don't have, right? So they are figuring out things brand new as they go along. So it's interesting.
We're going to keep bringing this up, that this law code was for the nation of Israel. Okay, at this time, it doesn't apply to the church, and so there's some things in here. We're looking for principles. Maybe there are some principles. There are things like if somebody's sick, maybe they shouldn't be out in public. That's a good timeless truth,
there are a number of things like that. And as I read some commentaries, this seems to be like the first nation that did those types of things, though.
At least that we have
documented,
right? Yeah, I mean, I think most
kind of cool.
Generally common sense says if you're sick, stay home.
Yeah, but
common sense
and nations and government is...
right, but to codify it as law, that seems to be a pretty big deal.
Yeah. Okay, so last week was all fun and game with skin diseases. Now we start out with bodily discharges.
Woohoo.
Right, 33 verses. Wow. Okay, so I read through these, and I made a list of what I got out of it. And here's what my list is.
Same list that everybody else is going to get probably, right?
Yeah. I saw a section on male bodily discharges. The discharge is always unclean. Okay. A section on how males go through a purification process.
Yep.
A section on female bodily discharges, also always unclean. And a section on purifications, which seem to be exactly the same as the males. And then lastly, a statement said that if a couple has sex, they're unclean until the evening.
Yeah.
But relying on me isn't the best, right? So a lot of times what I do is I'll write down what I see, and then I'll go to a commentary.
Yeah.
And that's kind of double checking yourself.
Right.
Now, you can misuse commentaries just like anything else. You can rely on them too much. I didn't have enough time, right? I had to pinch. I had to come up with something, right?
So then you just end up parroting what somebody else is written.
Yeah, right. And okay, that'll work for a night or two, but don't make a life out of it type of deal. So what I read was, this chapter is a lot about sex. and the idea is that the male bodily discharges are probably because of venereal diseases.
Could be.
That were going on there. And when a man has a normal semen discharge, there isn't a need for a purification process, but he is considered unclean for the evening.
Yeah.
So
that reminds us that just because it's in the law doesn't mean it's sin. Just because someone's considered unclean doesn't mean they're sinning or sinful, but we're talking about a ceremonial uncleanliness, right? So you can't immediately go to the tabernacle or whatever, okay? Got to take a bath, got to clean up before you're presentable in public again. That's really what we're talking about here.
Right.
And again, we've talked about this in the past, a lot of times we think, unclean, there's, sinning or there's sacrifices or everything in here has to do with sin. It really doesn't. A lot of this is daily law. It's civil law.
Yep.
It's not religious law.
Yeah. So much like the women can also be unclean, and the woman is also unclean during her menstrual cycle. And that seemed to me to be a huge burden. And again, I read the commentaries and what do the commentaries say on this?
Well, by the time you're thinking, especially with marriage, because in the law, the sex was for marriage, right? So all of the laws about sex tend to be outside of marriage, right? Because you're not supposed to be doing it. So if you're a young married Jewish woman, they usually didn't wean off nursing until the young child at that point was 2-3 years old, maybe older. So now you got multiple children that are still nursing and all that. That's really going to, in most women, now there's always exceptions, but in most women, if you're having kids regularly and you're nursing, your cycle is thrown way off. You may not even experience a cycle
during normal childbearing years.
Yeah, during childbearing years. So it could be years for some of these women. And even if they have one periodically within, this is not happening every month like most,
like we would think,
like we would typically think of when we're not having children all the time. We're not nursing for as long as they were, medication, birth control, all these other things that help regulate that. It's a completely different world.
Okay.
So I don't think it's nearly as much of a burden on them as, if we're taking our world and placing it back into theirs.
Right. So there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of laws about marriage yet.
Yeah.
And you kind of alluded to that. So what about adultery?
Adultery's already been taken care of. Do not commit adultery is one of the 10 commandments, right?
Right. So Exodus.
Yeah, Exodus 20. He's already taken care of that. In fact, in this week and next week, we'll get into more of the, this is who you, well, basically, don't have sex with anybody except for your wife. But there are certain things when it comes to sexual relations that were like over the top that God had to specifically mention because they were part of the pagan worship practices that he wanted to make of the Canaanites,
the people who live in there.
Yeah, right. So that he wanted to make sure that the Israelites stayed away from. So that he's going to bring it up. But the assumption was sex is for marriage. So there's going to be some laws, priests can marry certain people, can't marry certain people. For the most part, there didn't need to be a lot of laws about marriage.
Okay. So in chapter 16, we move to an entirely new subject, right? And it's called the Day of Atonement.
Woohoo! This is a great chapter.
Yeah, it is. So atonement, a rough definition would be reconciliation between God and mankind.
Yeah.
Humankind.
Yeah. Because basically what happened, the Hebrew word for atonement there means to cover. So Yom Kippur is the name. It means to cover. And what would happen, just in summary, is that the sacrificial system, the animals, the blood of the animals, the book of Hebrews reminds us of this, covered their sin. It made them right with God and the law, but it didn't actually take away their sin. It was foreshadowing Jesus. Jesus actually paid for sin. These animals just covered it, which is why they had to do it over and over and over. And Jesus did it only once. That's a major theme in the book of Hebrews.
So, like you said, Yom Kippur, generally celebrated end of September, early October.
Yeah. In our fall.
Yeah, in our
on
year.
their calendar, it's the beginning of their sacred calendar.
But the idea is the high priest would go in and make a sacrifice for the nation of Israel.
Yeah.
Right. So what happens today? Because there hasn't been a temple since AD 72.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
77?
Yeah. 70. So basically, they still celebrate Yom Kippur. And it leads right into the Feast of Tabernacles. So Yom Kippur is one day, and then it leads into the Feast of Tabernacles, which is a week. It's celebrated with family and with their community. But
there's no
sacrifice.
Priest, right?
There's no priest. There's no sacrifice. They can't sacrifice. But what they do is, because it is still about covering sin, forgiveness and prayer is a really big part of their liturgy at this point. So they offer prayers for forgiveness. They emphasize forgiveness of each other. They'll gather in synagogue or temple, what they call temple, and they'll offer prayers and scripture readings and stuff. It is a day of fasting that may or may not have been, depending on how you read it, required under the law, but that's how they've taken it. Okay, the rabbis have really taken it as, so it's a day of fasting. So they fast from sundown the previous day until sundown on Yom Kippur Day, and then they break their fast. They celebrate with a big feast then at the end of it.
And this is a perpetual holiday, right?
Yeah.
So once a year.
Every year,
right?
Every year, and it's the 10th day of their new sacred year. So you have Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is the new year. on the 1st, and then on the 10th of the month is Yom Kippur.
Okay. There's also some verses that we read where it talks about no work, and they're very explicit about it, even for native citizens and also for resident
It's considered a
foreigners.
high Sabbath. This is like the Sabbath of Sabbaths for the year, which is also why then some people say that the fast is required as well, because like nothing, you're not to do anything at all. This is a day that is completely set aside for the recognition of God and forgiveness. And
Yeah, I thought this was kind of cool in this chapter. They go through the entire process, and then there's a little summary at the end, which I was very thankful for, that little summary. But basically, it's what you would think would happen. The high priest has to purify the place that it's going to happen, and also purify the meeting tent, purify the altar. Then he makes atonement for the priests. Then it's the atonement for the people.
Yeah.
Right. He just kind of works his way down a logical line.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Anything else?
No, it's really the most important day of the Jewish sacred year. It's right at the beginning of the year. It cleanses the nation for the year. And if there's anything left over, because people could commit sins and not know about it, right?
Right.
So they could, even if it's not sin, they could break laws and not know about it. So what this did is this covered everything, and it basically gave them a fresh, clean slate to begin their new year with God.
Nice. Chapter 17, we start taking a little different direction. Where last couple chapters have been all about the priests, things they need to do. Now it's the people in general, right? And it starts out with blood guilt for the Jewish people, but it's from the people's point of view. But basically, all sacrificial animals have to be slaughtered by the priests as a peace offering to God.
Yeah.
So no fair for the people to do it themselves.
Well,
Right, no fair. I can't make my own offering.
well,
Is that
it's I can't do it on my own schedule. I can't do it at my house. I can't do it outside. I have to bring it to the tabernacle. It has to be done in the presence of the priest. So
through what we've been reading about for chapter after
So whether
chapter.
I'm doing it or whether the priest is doing it, it has to be done there.
There.
What God is trying to prevent is people setting up their own little shrines at home. Well, I walked past the tabernacle today and you couldn't believe the line, but before sundown I've got to do this thing. So I'm just going to do it at home, and and all
Which
of a
is
sudden
exactly what we saw in the book of Judges, right? Somebody set up a shop.
Exactly. So that's what it's not so much, you can't do this. It's you have to do this, and you have to do it my way, in my location.
Right. Let's see. Something hit me hard here. We're still in the desert, and we're at the time where God is actually taking care of the nation of Israel at this time. Which means that there's manna, and there's quail, small birds that are around here. Is there really a need for food, slaughtering animals?
So the thing about quail, it's sort of debated. Some people think it was a one-time thing or a two-time thing. Some people think it was, constantly. Right. Manna was every day. There's no doubt. They gathered the manna in the morning. But yes, so you sort of sometimes think, they had manna every day and that's all they ate. No, they had animals, and they're slaughtering animals, and the priests are eating meat, and they're, Passover and all these other things are eating meat. I think probably, but because you don't want to go through your entire, livestock, this year, I think probably manna was like maybe their main thing, and then everything else was supplemental. You're right. They thought that they were going to, in a matter of weeks, get to the land of Canaan. They didn't know that this was going to be 40 years, right? That was their fault, by the way. I'm not, but in a couple of weeks they were going to be able to go into the land of Canaan. So this wasn't supposed to be a long-term thing. So God did miraculously provide for them with the manna for the 40 years. But yeah, they weren't growing crops necessarily. There were oases, there were different things where they could get water and they could get, maybe some fruits or whatever. But manna was their number one, and I would guess that meat was supplemental to that.
Okay. God also makes a point in here saying, don't eat blood.
Yeah.
Right? For the life of every living thing is in its blood.
Yep.
I think that's kind of a cool verse. And then what also makes this special is there's a whole lot of rules in the Old Testament. Not all of them carry forward to the New Testament.
Yeah.
Some do, some don't. This is one that we see that does.
Yeah.
right? So in John, Jesus reiterates this.
Yeah, so in John 6, he actually pushes back against their, he had just done the feeding of the 5,000 and big thing. And then he gives them this hard teaching and says, you need to eat my flesh and drink my blood. They're like, we're not allowed to drink blood. What's all this? And he didn't argue that. He didn't say, well, no, you are allowed now. That he kept that in place. But of course, he was talking about his body and his blood, and he was talking about it figuratively, like he did at the Last Supper, right? But even before the nation of Israel, this really goes back to Genesis 9. After the flood, God said, you can eat animals now. They didn't eat animals before. You can eat animals now, but not the blood. And we see it show up again in Acts, and we see it show up again in the Jerusalem Council. So yeah, this is one of those timeless things. It's not just for Israel.
Right.
Even today, you don't eat blood. We're not supposed to eat blood. It's always been the case. It's gone all the way back to Genesis 9. That's been the case.
Interesting. All right, then we finish with chapter 18 for this week. And God starts with Moses, like he does in a lot of these chapters. Hey, tell the people, here's the rules. Here's the rule that they got to follow. Sometimes it's tell the priests what they have to follow.
Yeah, I think it's really cool though, because it begins. The Lord spoke to Moses. He's called the lawgiver. Yeah. There's one voice, and the people had already said in Exodus, we don't want to hear from God directly. You talk to God for us. Fine. So God talked to Moses, and Moses gave it to the people. And as you read through the book of Leviticus, it's a reminder that even though Moses is the one who's telling it, it's from God.
Right.
This is God's law. This isn't, we call it the Mosaic law. It's not really the law of Moses. Right. It's the law of God through Moses.
Right.
and I think that he intentionally put that in there.
Yeah, so a lot of these in chapter 18 are, quote, the sex rules.
Yeah.
Right?
Some of the stuff we've already talked about.
Yeah, and kind of the logical things that you were talking about too. Don't have sex with close relatives. Yeah. Okay, your spouse is okay.
Yeah.
But
what's interesting is this is the first time in the recorded Bible that we actually get that, first cousin, second cousin, how close is too close.
Yeah.
You don't find that anywhere in Genesis or Exodus. You have to get halfway through Leviticus before God actually codifies it. And again, it's for the nation of Israel. Medically, right. Genetically, we say, you've got to stay so many, degrees apart.
Right.
But this is the first time it shows up biblically.
Is that because we're far enough away now from Eden?
Yeah.
In the fall?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were no genetic mutations, no sicknesses, no illnesses, right. When God created, and that after sin, sort of became, came into our right. human race.
Right. Well, also there weren't a lot of choices. Right?
Yeah, right.
It took a while for the poppopulation to grow up and expand.
Yeah. So now you've got 2-3 million people just within the Jewish race. I don't like the word Jewish family. You don't have to marry your sister or your cousin. You've got further people out. And so he says, let's keep the family unit intact, and we will marry outside of this boundary.
Yeah. So there's a couple of these just want to hit quick. Don't have a wife and then marry her sister. Yeah. And then there's qualifications on that, right? If the first wife dies or there's a divorce or whatever, then it can be legal there.
Yeah.
No gay sex, no sex with animals. And then there's one that seemed odd to me. Don't give away your kids to Molech.
Yeah.
That seems oddly specific.
Yeah, because, and this is where the homosexual and the animals also comes in the same context, is those were things that the pagan nations were doing as part of their worship of their demon gods. Mm-hmm. So you've got people sacrificing their children as worship. You've got homosexual acts as worship, and you've got sex with animals as worship. And God uses terms like detestable and perversion and profane in that section. Right. And he wants, it's not, that sets that stuff apart from these other things. Right?
That's what he says too, right? This nation, my nation, needs to be set apart.
Completely. And that's really what the word holy is. We're going to see more and more in Leviticus here. Holy means set apart. It doesn't mean perfect. It means separated, okay. Right? Good. And so that's going to be a big deal. So he uses terms like abominations and stuff as he wraps up chapter 18.
Yeah. Well, I think we hit the big nail so far.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it ends, verse 30 ends with, so that you don't defile yourselves by them. Don't get sucked into the things of the nations around you. Today we would say don't get sucked into the things of the world, right? Christians need to be separate from the things of the world that can pervert us and lead us into things that are ungodly, right? So the timeless truth is don't let the world pervert you, right? Here it's specific to the nation of Israel.
Good.
So, yeah, starting to get into some of those details, right? Some of the laws that you usually think about in Leviticus, right? So it's interesting. It's worth reading. We keep saying this. Take your time. Read through it slowly. Don't just rush through it because it's like, why do I care about any of this stuff? This is what God said. At the beginning of every chapter, the Lord said to Moses. And so it is still the Word of God. And we may not be under these laws today, but we can find these timeless truths in here. And sometimes it's just a nugget. We still don't eat blood, right? Buried in the middle of stuff that, okay, maybe we have to do, maybe we don't have to do. But the purpose has always been stay separate from the pagans, from the world around you. And that is a truth that we want to make sure that we still apply today. So maybe you have some questions, maybe you have some comments. Feel free to send those our way. Until then, enjoy your reading, and we will be back next week to continue in the book of Leviticus.
Bye, everybody.